Welcome back to Modernization and Dependency. So, we're talking about how the Western ideologies inserts their ideas and their values and their beliefs into another culture. But we also need to take into account is how that culture can now become dependent on the developed country. And that dependency can lead to them losing their own culture and start to lose a sense of what that indigenous knowledge and the values that they had. So I have the figure 23 example there of how a culture might start to become depend on skin lightening treatments. And this is quite popular in a lot of places around the world. And they might consider that they have to look and be like the Western ideologies that have been so ingrained into them. So we've talked about the hypodermic needle. We also may need to consider how there is this ethnocentric world vision that this is how in the paradigm things should be represented. And they're saying here that developed countries are injecting into the minds of developing countries who offer no resistance or modifying, and they're changing their own behavior. The paradigm is a poor approach for communication for social transformation, of course, because it's an ethnocentric, which is that one culture is superior to another culture and ignores the complexity of change and the consequences of economic, political, and cultural macro process on a local level. So here we do need a need for a social transformation. They talk about how the dependency paradigm says the world consists of core states and satellites. The core states are the developed countries economically and politically, and the satellites are the developing countries exploited by the core states. And this is what it says in the textbook. The exploitation takes on forms of the use of natural resources, cheap labor that benefits the core states, and the satellites use them for their own growth. They say Latin American states argue that if they were independent of Western core states, it could lead to their own independence in the satellite states. They would be allowed to be self-reliant and give power back to their own developing countries. But because the core states are strongly grounded in the global economy, it's very difficult to do this. Elites, though, which is people of the higher culture, higher class in satellite states, benefit personally from core states. Developing countries need to sort of break away from the world market to grow economically, but they're too weak at this point to develop for themselves because they've been so used to the Western, say, the food that's there, being part of the international market, which is fine, but having all those cultural artifacts have been so ingrained in their own culture that you tend to lose yourself and become so dependent on it that there is no independence. And once again, the section is looking at there would be a need for social transformation. So, in this section, emphasizes a way of communication between cultures. There should be a focus on two-way balanced communication instead of that one linear Lasswell model of communication of just sending out cultural text to be consumed in Western ideologies, but a two-way communication there. And a dialogue needed between cultures that focus on long-term issues and solutions. So a new perspective is evolved here. They talk about the definition of communication with social transformation is a strategic dialogic process that uses communication of dialogue. Communicators participate on equal footing. And you can just read through those examples on page 243. This participatory approach to communication for social transformation was conceptualized to address problems from the modernization paradigm and focus on that one-way communication. So this approach stresses on the importance of cultural identity of local communities, democratization, international, national, local, and individual participation, and the strategy of traditional receivers. This model is very human and person-centered and not looking for economic growth, and you can look more at the examples of participatory approach in social change, but we should look at this paradigm is the three principles which are empowerment, participation, and dialogue on page 243. So within social transformation, the satellite state, or at least the satellites they call it, need to do these things to become a breakaway from the core states and start to participate in that social transformation, hence why it's called the participatory paradigm. Empowerment is the first one, which is become empowered by their surroundings, If the surroundings allow people freedom to express themselves, solve problems, or address their interests, they must find their own solutions to their own problems and take ownership of those problems to be truly empowered. The indigenous knowledge that might have surfaced within their own culture is very important to solving those problems. This can create a sense of freedom and humanity, and there could also be a psychological closeness of finding problems and making decisions with one another. There are a lot of programs that raises levels of empowerment in various nations, and I've attached this link as well in your lesson plan that looks at the focus of how a lot of cultures are trying to become more independent and work for their own community and break away from Western sort of control there. Next is participation. There can no longer be a sort of submissive role, but there needs to be two-way interaction, power equalization by locals. The local people would have control. They would be involved in all stages of a developmental process. The participation should bring forth sustainable results. Participation shows that communities' true problems and needs are addressed and encourages their own self-sufficiency. Lastly, using dialogue for social transformation, the theory that people want to be free of internal external suppression, individuals possess ability to change themselves through dialogue. The way they talk, the right, are all influenced and formed by the interaction dialogue with other people, and people communicate through self-reflection and adding others' self-reflection. So this is all part of in your textbook and all the different strategies that can help them sustain and become more part of social transformation than relying on the Western ideology and becoming more independent and a developed country than developing and dependent. So they go on to talking about that we need to create shared meaning as well in the dialogue process, and when one reaches mutual understanding, which we already know about, then this is where shared meaning and real communication will occur, and this should be seen as a process of liberating dialogue. What this approach does not look at is, are communities truly involved in the decision-making process? So the assumption here is that people, if they do these things, they will become more empowered as a community or a country, but are they going to be involved? Are they truly going to be involved in the decision-making process? Sometimes decision makers can bring upon their own gender here. And they also talk about for various health crises, a top-down approach would be more effective than everyone trying to decide equally what to do. Sometimes there needs to be a sort of classic business approach. And the approach could be used to dominate community, where the communication agent attempts to dominate them. So someone that can be in charge as well. We've completed Learning Unit 5. Please see your lesson plan and complete the textbook activities, which you can find along the info byte to read that, the surfs up, the what do you think? And then we have textbook activities always at the back of each chapter. So please look at that. Look at your lesson plan VC Learn activities, your non-VC Learn activities. And remember, write down notes to discuss with your lecturer further, because you need to be looking through those textbook examples and assisting that further in your studies.